once again, a very good morning to our viewers for joining us on our Friday morning as we're taking yet another look at Reading Room. Picking up where we left off on our last Reading Room session, we're taking a look at 1984 by George Orwell. Right, George Orwell's 1984 might be a book that some of us might have come across in our educational journey. Some of us might have different levels of approachability and likeliness towards the book. However, as we have unpacked, right, hello, hi TikToker. I'm TikToker, yes, indeed you are. Okay. Yes, so as we've covered 1984 yesterday in our introductory session, we look at 1984 not really as a piece of fantasy and pure fiction like Harry Potter or Game of Thrones, nor is it a piece of non-fiction or informative text. It lies somewhere in the middle along that spectrum, looking at a piece of speculative fiction. What is speculative fiction? Speculative fiction comes from the word to speculate, right? To make a prediction, to make a forecast, or a guess. So keep in mind, 1984 was written by George Orwell at the turn of the century in the 1900s, right after the Second World War. He was taking a look from 1949, taking a look at 35 years into the future. What would the future world of 1984 look like back then? Thus, he wrote 1984 over here as an idea of how society could progress if mankind were to lean on its worst ideals, leading to what is called a dystopian fiction piece over here. What is a dystopian fiction piece? A dystopian society talks about a nightmarish, imperfect world which leads to widespread suffering among humankind. Right, hi Elroy, thank you for joining in this morning. Okay, right, thank you for loving my voice. I also love your comments as well. Okay, some examples of dystopian fiction that some of you might have read before or might have come across in different mediums of art, not only in books or novelizations, but also in television series and films include The Hunger Games, the Divergent series, and the Maze Runner series of books, and then subsequently movies. Okay. On the other hand, on the flip side of it, from dystopian we move to utopian. Utopian societies are societies that are seemingly perfect, that embody the best of human ideals. Okay. For example, last session when we left off, we talked about The Giver. The Giver, which is a book by Lois Lowry that's been subsequently adapted into a movie starring Brenton Thwaites from Titans, Taylor Swift, Jeff Bridges, and even Meryl Streep as actors in that movie. And we also have The People Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, the science fiction writer. Again, this is a short story that you're interested in, and for all the K-pop fans out there, I think there's a BTS music video inspired by The People That Walk Away from Omelas. So if you're interested in this, you can go and watch that video after the live stream over here to see if you can catch any references to this short story about a utopian society. Okay. But this story does not exist in and of itself when you look at 1984. We also need to talk about the main messages of 1984. Firstly, looking at the pursuit of utopia. How do we pursue an ideal society, and at what cost are we willing to bear it? At the same time, we're looking at totalitarianism, also known as state control. How much control does the state exert or the government exert over its people? Are they free to live their lives, or do governments have an overarching say in how they go about living their lives? Which leads to our third message over here, our third theme of freedom versus oppression. Okay. How much freedom should our people or should individuals have versus how much oppression can we tolerate as a society in order for the better good? Okay. Right, good morning Cosma. Welcome as well. We are unpacking and recapping on the main ideas of 1984. Okay. And on the line of freedom versus oppression, freedom does not only mean the freedom to act, freedom to behave, freedom to move around, but freedom of thought as well, which leads to propaganda and truth. How true and how free are our thoughts if the information we receive isn't necessarily reflective of the reality around us? If we are being fed propaganda or falsehoods, misleading information over here to push a certain idea upon the people, are we really free to think? Are we really free in facing the truth? Or are we really just falling prey to propaganda? Okay. Moving on to our fifth topic of war versus control, right? Thinking about how do we use war between external parties as a means to control the populace within the domestic sphere, right? Using war as an excuse to enforce or to put in place certain measures that might be pretty harsh. For example, a curfew or very tight regulations on the people living within your society or your community, with the excuse or justification being that it is for the greater purpose of fighting a war. And this all boils down to this final theme of collectivism versus individualism. Do we work for the greater good, for the greater harmony of everyone, or do we focus and emphasize on the individual? Or is there perhaps a balance we can strike in the middle over here? Are these ideals necessarily antithetical or posed against each other? Okay. Right? Any questions before we begin? Where we pick up from where we left on? Can zoom in. Okay, right. Michelle, I understand your concern as well. The screen can be a bit small. So because this tablet is being arranged in the landscape mode over here, so I understand that occasionally there are some points that are a bit smaller on the screen, but if there are points of emphasis, I will zoom in also, so for greater clarity, so you can take a screenshot or you can refer it directly on your mobile device. Okay, right, thank you very much, Michelle, for the tip over here. I'll keep that in mind also. If there are emphasis points, I'll also change up the font and the highlight to draw your attention to it apart from zooming in on the screen as well. Okay. Right, are we good to continue on where we left off yesterday? Right, so we left off yesterday in the middle of chapter 1. We're talking about our protagonist, the main character of 1984, Winston Smith, on his way to work, right? Many of us in our chat over here, maybe we are at work or we're at school. Perhaps it's not too great a feeling. Even Winston Smith in the story over here, we understand that it isn't a great feeling walking into your workplace early in the morning. Okay? So Winston Smith is a worker at the Ministry of Truth. Okay? And that immediately brings a bit of questions to our minds, right? In Singapore, for many of our viewers over here who are from Singapore, we have different ministries such as the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Law, Ministry of Information and Communications. But what about Ministry of Truth? What does it concern itself with? Okay. Here we see Winston explaining to the reader over here what do the different ministries helm. There are 4 main ministries within their nation of Oceania. Right, we have the Ministry of Truth where Winston works in, talking about the news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. Okay. So this should immediately raise some red flags or alarm bells in our minds over here. Ministry of Truth, who is the purveyor or who decides what is truth and what isn't? And how does that filter down into the aspects of news, where people consume their information to form their opinions and facts and basis? Entertainment, where people choose to unwind and relax and perhaps they let their minds lapse into a less critical mode of consumption. Education, where they form their beliefs and bedrock of their values to live out the rest of their lives, and even the fine arts for appreciation. Okay. Next, we have a Ministry of Peace, which concerns itself with war. Right? This can sound a bit contradictory to some of us over here. Why is the Ministry of Peace in charge of war? Right? They seem to be completely opposing ideals. Next, we have the Ministry of Love, yet again juxtaposed against the role of law and order, right? Some of us might understand love as something that can be a bit irrational. For example, falling in love at first sight, or love cannot really be governed by law. So why is it a Ministry of Law? Ministry of Love is in charge of enforcing law and order, and finally a Ministry of Plenty, which is responsible for economic affairs. Okay. So a lot of these job descriptions and the names of these ministries are quite paradoxical in nature. They don't really make sense together, which is one of the core tenets of this book, which we introduced early on in this chapter, with the 3 slogans: war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. Why is this repeated by the party? Why did the party choose to adopt these 3 slogans as their calling card? Okay. Something to think about as we move on into chapter 1. Okay. As a bit of fruit for thought for our viewers who left off yesterday, I had this additional question for those who chose to remain. Why do we choose these specific names over here? Why do we think the party chose the specific names of truth, peace, love, and plenty to describe the roles or to give a name to these departments that have completely different or antithetical roles and duties to fulfill over here? Okay, something to think about. Okay, but let's proceed on with how these ministries are further characterized in the first chapter. Their names in Newspeak are Mini True, Mini Pax, Mini Love, and Mini Plenty. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. of it. It was a place impossible to enter, except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests. Even the streets leading up to the outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms armed with jointed truncheons. Okay. So we see a very specific word choice over here. For those of you who study literature, you will understand this concept as diction. Specific choices of words over here. A maze signifying it's confusing, difficult to escape or to get out of. Barbed wire, steel doors, hidden machine gun nests, all heightening this atmosphere of aggression, heightening this atmosphere and this image of a threatening place. Okay. Which is at odds with this name of this ministry, Ministry of Love, right? When you think of love, you do not think about barbed wire. Hope you don't. You don't think about steel doors, you don't think about machine guns or gorilla-faced guards in black uniform. So why is this the case? Winston turned around abruptly. Okay, this is something that some of us can use, especially for our primary school viewers or those of us who have primary school exam takers in our families. Abruptly over here means suddenly. Okay. So if you're writing in your paper 1 for composition, you don't want to keep using the transition suddenly, all of a sudden, in that moment. You can also use abruptly over here to signify a sudden change of events. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of the day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen. And he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-coloured bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colourless liquid with a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly oily smell as of Chinese rice spirit. Okay. So over here we see an excellent use of imagery. This is useful, especially not only for our primary school writers who are writing your narrative compositions in your paper 1, but especially for our secondary school writers who have your descriptive essays for your paper 1 as well, right? Apart from your discursive and expository and argumentative essays, you also have your descriptive essays. Okay. Imagery over here relating to your 5 senses. Which senses do we engage? We have our sense of sight talking about dark-coloured bread, the bottle of colourless liquid with a plain white label. Not just talking about the colour of it, but also the features, or rather the lack of distinctive features on it. It is just plain and colourless. At the same time, we also engage our sense of smell, right? Our olfactory senses over here, a sickly, oily smell as of Chinese rice spirit. So we see over here, George Orwell has very effectively engaged 2 of our 5 senses over here, our sense of sight and our sense of smell over here, by describing this scene, thus fulfilling the purpose of imagery. Okay, so sense of sight and smell. Visual and olfactory senses over here. Okay, any questions? Right, after pouring out nearly a teacup full, Winston nerved himself for a shock and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly, his face turned scarlet and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, move this out of the way. Okay. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had a sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from the crumpled packet, marked Victory Cigarettes, and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick, quarter-size blank book with a red back and a marbled cover. Okay. After reading through this passage over here, again very vivid imagery, but one thing that you would take note of if you are rather eagle-eyed, what is the name of the cigarette brand over here? What is the name of the cigarette brand? We have Victory cigarettes, right? Victory brand cigarettes. Are there any Victory other names with the word Victory in them? Right, in our previous page we also saw Victory Gin. And Winston himself, our protagonist, lived in a place called Victory Apartments. Victory Mansions, sorry. Okay, Winston's apartment is called Victory Mansions. Okay, so this should raise some alarm in our minds over here. Something that happens once or twice might be a coincidence, but within the first chapter itself, we already see 3 different objects with the same brand or the same name of Victory. So this is probably more of a coincidence than we are comfortable to accept over here. Why is everything over here in this world of 1984 under the party labeled Victory? What kind of image or what kind of ideal is it trying to sell to its citizens over here if everything in their whole lives are surrounded by the sense of victory? Okay. Does it make them feel victorious and proud of where they are? Does it make them feel comfortable and complacent in their existing lives? Do they start developing a sense of security and a sense of complacency to live their lives as they are without demanding for change if they are already living and surrounded by victory? Okay? Something to think about over here. Why is everything in this world labeled victory? For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed as was normal in the end wall where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall opposite the window. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove. Okay. An alcove over here could be seen as... You could view it as a corner, a slight corner in a room where you could store items within. Okay. A shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. Okay, so let's see what plan is Winston hatching over here. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. Again, use of imagery over here. Imagery in the form of sight. Right, if you recall in our last reading room session, we talked about different elements and dimensions of sight. We have color, the color of an object, the size and scale of it, and also the texture of it. What is material, what is its surface like, how does it feel in your hands for texture. Okay. We look at this paper over here, smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age. So again, we see it scores on the points of color as well as texture, visual texture. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town, and he had been immediately stricken by an overwhelming desire to possess it. To be stricken over here? To be stricken, it means to be struck. He immediately had the idea or the overwhelming desire to possess this book. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops, but the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase. Even with nothing written in it, it was a compromising possession. Okay, so this is an interesting excerpt over here that sheds a bit of light into the world built within 1984 that Winston resides in. Party members who are officially employed in the official capacity by the party are not allowed to go into ordinary shops, or rather dealing on the free market as stated in the book over here, nor are they allowed to possess any books. Okay? I'm sure most of us, if we are carrying textbooks to school every day in our school bags, we also do not want to be in possession of books. But let's think about it for a moment. Why are they not allowed to carry books? And as a further extension, what purposes do books serve? What are the uses of books over here that could potentially make it dangerous or compromise the message of the party over here? Okay. As much as we begrudgingly admit, books are an excellent form to transmit and to communicate information from one person to the next by listing down ideas, thoughts, ways of beliefs and values into paper, into print, to transmit and allow these ideas to proliferate over time. So as a result, by banning or rather restricting the circulation of books in this society, what is this party trying to achieve over here by banning or restricting the circulation of books? It is in turn trying to restrict or to curtail the circulation of certain ideas, certain freedoms of expression over here that is transmitted through the medium of books. Something to think about. The thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. This was not legal, but if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Okay. So again, we see another instance of contradiction. Contradiction over here, right? In most modern judicial systems, including within Singapore, you understand that if you commit a crime that is illegal, it flouts the legal codes and statutes listed out, you would face punishment as a result. However, while opening a diary is not illegal, punishment would still ensue even if this act was not illegal, right? And this punishment is definitely disproportionate by our modern standards, where you'll be punished by death or sent to 25 years in a forced labor camp just for opening a diary. Winston fitted a nib on the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures. So let's take note of some of these vocab over here. Archaic here means ancient or outdated. Seldom used even for signatures, and he procured one furtively and with some difficulty, simply because of the feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Okay, to procure is to obtain. Okay, maybe our primary and secondary school listeners might not understand this word over here, outdated. But especially for viewers who are already in the workforce, working in different levels of the supply chain in logistics, you know, procurement over here talks about obtaining goods and services and transporting it across different areas. Furtive. To be furtive is to be stealthy, so as not to draw any attention to yourself. It deserves to be written of a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speak-write, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. Okay, to falter is to hesitate, to pause, A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decisive act. In small, clumsy letters, he wrote, April 4th, 1984. Okay. The significance of this moment might be lost on us, right? Every day we write our dates on the worksheet, on our pieces of work, on our assignments. Every day we write the date, including today. However, in his society, in this 1984 society in the book, what Winston just did could warrant life imprisonment, a death sentence, or forced labor work. So he had just committed what can be seen as a very egregious crime over here, hence his immediate reaction over here. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. This phrase over here would be good to use, especially for upper primary writers over here, talking about situations where you're in emergency, where you need to lend a helping hand to someone in need. Could talk about a sense of complete helplessness descending upon our main character, describe their emotional state. Remember, a key idea of describing emotions is to show, not tell. Instead of just stating, I feel helpless, that is to tell the reader directly how you are feeling. It's important to show this feeling of helplessness over here, which is a sense of complete helplessness descending upon you. Okay, so very important rule of thumb, figurative writing, show, not tell. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and believed he could have been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. Okay. So this should be fairly startling to some of us, right? The moment you wake up after fainting or after falling unconscious, the first thing people will ask you will be, what's your name? How old are you? What year is it? What day is it? Right? So by not even having any clear grasp or clear handle on his age, which year he was born in, where was he even existing in the timeline of human history, it gives a certain sense of depersonalization, removing his personal identity away from his sense of self over here. This goes back to one of our main themes of the book, looking at state control and collectivism versus individualism. Can a person be free to be who they are if they do not even have the basic information about who they are, what comprises their identity? They don't know how old they are, they don't know which year they were born, they don't even know which year they are currently in. So can they truly be free in this sense over here if they do not have a basic grip or handle on reality? Okay. Echoing a main message over here, the main theme of the book of 1984. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? Okay. We've seen this word whom. Whom is a pronoun that has tripped up many students, especially not only at the primary but even at secondary level. And I have even seen some adults in the workplace as well send out emails that improperly use this pronoun of whom. Okay, when do you use whom? When do you use who? Okay. Oops, no. Okay, a bit of grammar practice. Who is used to refer to the subject of the sentence, while whom is used to refer to the object of the sentence. Okay. To see this in practice, you can join us later on for our noontime session for our practice paper on the P5 Nanyang end of year 2023 paper. One of the first few grammar MCQ questions will touch on this topic on who versus whom. When do you use either pronoun in a sentence? Okay. So if you're interested to see this in action later on, remember to take a note and join us for our next session. Okay. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future? For the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word double think. Okay. Highlight this. Draw attention to this. Alright, double think is an important concept that we're revisiting multiple times in the book later on. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? Okay. Firstly, magnitude over here. Magnitude refers to impact, right? If you are keeping up to date with current affairs around the world, you know that earthquakes, natural disasters around the world are measured on the Richter scale of magnitude, right? Magnitude 6 or magnitude 7 earthquake can be quite devastating to a community. Okay. But magnitude over here means the impact of what he had just done. How could he communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament could be meaningless. Okay. Predicament is an excellent vocab word they can take note of. Predicament would be a difficult or dire situation. Okay. A question from Moments over here. Apologies for not responding to this question earlier from the comments. Can I show helplessness by submitting an empty script? Okay. I think referring to the earlier point about showing, not telling, this feeling of helplessness descending upon Winston. Can you show helplessness by submitting an empty script? That definitely conveys the idea of helplessness to your examiner or to your marker. But of course, you could probably also write something out based on the basic outline of the story, okay? So I get that you're putting in a sarcastic comment over here, but on a more productive note, definitely there are other ways you can go about trying to score a bare minimum of the mark, okay? The intention of a marker is never to fail a student or to fail a paper. It is to assess if you have the basic grasp and fundamental understanding of the requirements of the exam question. So as long as you submit a reasonable take on the question, you don't write stories about aliens and werewolves and vampires, it will be a story that will garner you at least a passing grade over here, and that is far better than you have gotten by submitting an empty script. Okay, wherever possible, markers will be looking to award and validate any marks, any possible points they can, especially for students that are struggling. So try your best wherever you can and make sure all your hard work does not go to waste by submitting an empty script over here. Okay, thank you very much. 65 moments. For some time, he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he had seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. Okay. This is something that will be a core message of the book over here. Not only did he lack the power in expressing himself, expressing his thoughts, expressing his opinion, he could not even hold on to and to remember what he was intending to say. He cannot hold on to his original purpose or intention over here. Okay. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment. And he had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable restless monologue that had been running inside his head literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it had always been inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. Once again, this phrase over here is good for building suspense in your story. Okay. Building suspense, heightening the tension in your writing, you can use the seconds ticked by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of his skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music, and a slight booziness caused by the gin. Okay. Once again, we see very effective use of imagery. In this case here, we see a sensory sensory saturation over here of imagery. In the sense of sight, the blankness of the paper. Sense of touch, sense of feel, the itching of your skin, the slight booziness of the gin, and sense of sound, right? The blaring of the music. Okay. So again, engaging 3 of your senses over here to build up on the imagery. Right? If you enjoy playing video games, you know that you can combo your attacks to make them stronger, right? So similarly for imagery as well in your writing, if you level and you scaffold with multiple levels and multiple applications of imagery across different senses, you can level up your writing to deliver a combo punch to your examiner. Okay, so very excellent use of imagery as well. Suddenly he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding first its capital letters and even finally its full stops. April 4th, last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by shots of a great, huge, fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise, then you saw him through the helicopter gun sights. Then he was full of holes, and the sea around him turned pink, and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water, audience shouting with laughter. When he sank, then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman. Might have been a Jewess sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him although he was blue with fright. She was blue with fright herself, all the time covering him as much as possible as though her arms could keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among them terrific flash, and the boat went all to matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, right up into the air. A helicopter with a camera in its nose might have followed it up, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats. But a woman down in the pro part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting. They didn't honor of show them, not in front of kids, they didn't. It ain't right, not in front of kids. It ain't until the police turn her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares about what the pros say. Typical pro reaction, they never. Right. So throughout this diary entry over here, you can see how his writing, or the expression of his writing over here, the clarity of his thought, the clarity of his expression, devolves in articulation. Firstly, it starts off pretty normal, perhaps a bit grammatically incoherent, but he's talking about a visit to the movies and then describing the plot of the movie. But you can see as he continues writing on, as he has to write a longer piece of work, all his language fundamentals fall away. He lacks the ability to express himself, to express his thoughts, express his memories. He's unable to communicate them from what's inside his brain to the outside world. We start seeing capital letters at the start of sentences being dropped, followed by punctuation marks that are incoherently placed, all the way towards the last portion over here, a distinct lack of paragraphing, all the way to the end over here is just a complete stream of consciousness rambling, right? Complete jumble of incoherent words over here. No clear sentence breakers, no clear punctuation marks, no clear sentences or basic sentence structure you expect. So you can see over here how it becomes incoherent. It becomes difficult to understand for him to even express his thoughts to us, the reader. Okay. Why is this important? Just because this doesn't make sense to us, does that mean it's unimportant? Not quite, right? Take note, Winston is not just someone who is someone lacking in language fundamentals or someone who perhaps isn't well trained. He works for the party. He works for the government of the day. He is an employed worker working in the ministry, and yet he lacks the basic ability to articulate his thoughts, to communicate what he actually means coherently from one person to the next, the reader, right? So what does that speak of in this world over here that Winston lives in, where even someone as accomplished as him, with all his qualifications, lacks this basic fundamental ability to communicate and to articulate his thoughts in a coherent manner, in a fluent manner to someone else? Okay? Something to think about over here. Why does Orwell drive home this point about how Winston cannot communicate? Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramps. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish. But the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. It was, now he realized, because of this other incident that he had suddenly decided to come home and began the diary today. It happened this morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. Right, nebulous here is a word some of us might be unfamiliar with. Okay. Those of us who are into astronomy, you know what is a nebula in space, right? A nebula referring to a dark, unexplored region in space. Nebulous also carries that same meaning. The etymology of the word comes from nebula, talking about something that is vague or ambiguous. That cannot be easily defined. It was nearly 1100, and at the records department where Winston worked, they were dragging chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall opposite the big telescreen. Okay. This could be of particular interest to some of us over here who have worked in the military or different levels of regimentation. When do we use 1100? 1100 is used for military time, right? Instead of having your 12-hour cycles of AM and PM, in military time they use from 0000 hours, 12 AM, all the way to 2300 hours, 11 PM. Okay. So this is only in the military in our current world, but in their world of 1984, everyone follows along this time convention of 100 hours. So what does that tell us about this society if it is following a military convention? Okay. What does this tell us about this society if one of their basic aspects of going about life, the way they tell time, is heavily rooted within military regimentation? Where they were dragging chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall opposite the big telescreen in preparation for the 2 minutes hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people whom he knew by sight but had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department. Interesting line over here. In the Ministry of Truth, where Winston works in the Ministry of Truth, there is a fiction department, right? What does this tell us about the ministry? Okay. Presumably, since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner, she had some mechanical job on one of the novel writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27, with thick hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times round the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths, and community hikes and general clean-mindedness, which she was managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies, and dozers out of unorthodoxy. At this point over here, we need to make a very clear distinction between the narrator and the author. Okay, the narrator and the author. The narrator over here is Winston. Winston is a character in this novel who is telling us the world from his point of view. The author is George Orwell. Okay, it's important to keep in mind the narrator and the author are two different people. They are two different characters. They do not represent each other. In some cases, some authors might write an autobiography. In this case, the narrator would be the author. However, in this piece of fiction, the narrator is not the author. Okay. So this needs to be very clearly made over here. This distinction is important because the ideas that Winston has over here, they are quite misogynistic, describing women as being bigoted, swallowers and of slogans, amateur spies and dozers out. These are the views of Winston the narrator. These are not the views of the author George Orwell. Nor are they ideas that we should uncritically consume as the reader. Just because it's printed out on the page doesn't mean it is true, doesn't mean that we should believe it and accept it at face value. Okay, very important point for us to read critically as well. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once, when they passed in the corridor, she gave him a quick sidelong glance, which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the Thought Police. That it was true was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in it as well as hostility, whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party and holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people around the chairs as they saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching. Excuse me. O'Brien was a large burly man with a thick neck and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a trick of resetting his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming, in some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff box. Okay. Take note over here, this lengthy portion is an important part of characterization. Okay, let me move this out of the way. Describing human characters. Okay. Especially for our primary school writers, when you're writing a composition question, you might come across a picture of a human character inside, right? Whether it's an elderly woman, whether it's a little child, whether it's an adult. You might come across a picture of a human character within one of your pictures. So how do you describe human characters in your writing? To describe human characters in your writing, you can follow this line of thought over here. Describe their actions. Right, over here we see George Orwell describing O'Brien's actions. He had a trick of resetting his spectacles on his nose in a disarming manner. Okay. Describe their physical appearances. Right, what do you see? He was a large burly man, his stature, thick neck, distinctive features, and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. So describing his physical appearance, how does he look like? And finally, describing their facial expressions. How do they appear to look like in the picture, right? Are they looking sad, overjoyed, or angry? Okay. Humorous, brutal face. Okay. Right, so these three lines over here are the excellent way for you to be able to describe a human character vividly to your reader, as well as to your examiner, to make sure they understand which picture you're using over here. Provide additional details that are present in the picture to your examiner in terms of what actions they carry out, how do they look like in the picture, and what facial expressions do they display in the picture. Okay. If you need help remembering these 3 points, remember humans evolved from apes, right? Humans evolved from apes, so follow the APE rule when you're describing humans. Okay. Follow the APE rule when describing humans for actions, physical appearance, and expressions. Okay. Any questions? Okay. This is an excellent way to describe your human characters vividly to your examiner. So primary school writers, please take note of this point. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize-fighter's physique. Okay. To be intrigued by something is to be curious about it, or interested. Much more, it was because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. Okay. Orthodoxy over here. Orthodox is something that is following. Okay, to follow. His political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. And again, perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face. Simple intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person that you could talk to if somehow you could cheat the telescreen and get him alone. Winston had never the smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay in the records department until the 2 minutes hate was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple of places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston was in between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. Again, back to APE describing the physical appearance of people over here. A small, sandy-haired woman followed by a girl with dark hair. So physical appearance to describe and characterize your human characters in your story. The next moment, a hideous grinding speech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and backslider who once, long ago, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself, and then had engaged in counter-revolutionary activities, had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The programs of the 2 Minutes Hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defouler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations, sprang directly out of his teaching. Okay? Treachery over here, that means a betrayal. Somewhere or other, he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters. Perhaps even, so it was occasionally rumored, in some hiding place in Oceania itself. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face and yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in a long thin nose, near the end of which a pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice too had a sheep-like quality. What we see over here is yet again describing a person, but devolving into stereotypical depictions. To depict someone by stereotypes instead of an authentic representation of their image. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party, an attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet just plausible enough to fill one with an alarmed feeling that other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken in by it. Okay, I have a question in the chat over here. What is the purpose, or what is George Orwell's purpose of relying on a stereotypical depiction? Okay, good question. In this case over here, we need to make sure we distinguish between the writer and the narrator, right? In this case over here, yes, it is conscious choice by Orwell to employ this depiction of Goldstein over here along a stereotypical lens, but at the same time, he is doing it from the point of view of the party. The party is the one that is depicting Goldstein according to this stereotype. Okay? By using a stereotype instead of a real person over here, it helps to enforce a certain bias that you have according to this image. If you see a picture of a real person or image of a real person, perhaps you have a certain sense of empathy towards them, a certain sense of human empathy or human sense of solidarity with them. However, if you were to stretch out their features to a caricature, to a stereotype of a person, a stereotype of a certain group of people, you end up enforcing your biases towards them, end up emboldening and embedding and entrenching these biases that you have about these groups of people without actually trying to consider them as human individuals just like you and me. Okay. So back to this stereotypical depiction over here. In this depiction, Goldstein was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. And all this in rapid polysyllabic speech, which was sort of a parody. Okay, some big words over here that I need to unpack. Okay, to denounce is to criticize or to disavow. Okay. To cry hysterically. Right, what does it mean to cry hysterically over here? To be in hysterics refers to a loss of control. Okay, so uncontrollably. All this in rapid polysyllabic speech. Okay. What is the word polysyllabic? Polysyllabic can be broken up. Syllabic, of course, referring to your syllables, right? Poly refers to many, right? If a polygon, it is an object with multiple sides, right? A polygon. So words with multiple syllables. All this in rapid polysyllabic speech, which was a sort of parody of the habitual style of the orators of the party, and even contained newspeak words. More newspeak words indeed than any party member would normally use in real life. And all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered. Okay. Claptrap over here referring to his mouth, but it's mouth used as a slang, right? So I wouldn't recommend using it in your writing. Okay, it's used in a more dismissive sense. Okay, negative use. Behind his head on the telescreen there marched an endless column of the Eurasian army. Row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, who swam up to the surface of the screen and vanished to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull, rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed the background to Goldstein's bleating voice. Before the hit had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred, more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia, since when Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But what was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day and 1,000 times a day on platforms, on the telescreen, in newspapers, in books, his theories were refuted, smashed and ridiculed, held up to the general gaze of the pitiful rubbish that they were, in spite of all this, his influences never seemed to grow less. Always there were fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies, saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was the commander of a vast shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators dedicated to the overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There were also whispers, stories of a terrible book, a compendium of all heresies of which Goldstein was the author and which circulated clandestinely with here and there. Okay. Clandestinely over here refers to secretive activities. It was a book without a title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book. But one knew of such things only through vague rumors. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that any ordinary party member would mention if there was any way of avoiding it. In its second minute, the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting at the top of their voices in an effort to drown the maddeningly bleating voice that came from the screen. The little sunny-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her face was opening and shutting like that of a landed fish. Okay, over here we see an example of what we learned in our previous reading room session, right? To compare one thing to another based on a shared characteristic by using the keyword of like and as, what is that writing mechanic called? It is a simile. Okay, a recap of what we learned in our last reading room session. A simile is a writing mechanic used to compare one thing to another based on a shared characteristic or a shared feature using the keyword of like or as. For example, like that of a landed fish. So in this case here, this woman's action of opening and closing her mouth was compared to that of a fish that's left out of water trying to gasp for air. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as though he was standing up to the assault of a wave. The dark-haired woman behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine, swine, swine." And suddenly she picked up a heavy newspaper dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. Question over here, what does inexorably mean? Okay, let me highlight this. It's a word that some of us might have not come across before, but it simply means over something that is impossible to stop or impossible to prevent. So, unstoppable. Okay? Or inevitable. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but on the contrary that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness. A desire to kill, torture, smash faces in with a sledgehammer seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one object to another, like the flame of a blow lamp. Again, this is an example of our viewers who are tuning in. What is this an example of? What writing mechanic is this? What writing mechanic is this? This is an example of a simile yet again. Right, talking about the shared characteristic between the flame of a blow lamp, how it can easily be switched on and off, similarly to the emotions, the intense emotions felt by the people within the crowd, how it can be easily directed without any clear sense of direction or movement. Thus, in one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary against Big Brother, the party, and the top police. And in such moments, his heart went out to the lonely, derided heretic on the stick screen, sole guardian of truth and sanity in a world of lies. And yet, the very next instant, he was at one with the people about him, and all that was said of Goldstein seemed to him to be true. At those moments, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed to adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia, and Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable by the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. Once again, we see the employment of similes over here. Goldstein's words were like some sinister enchanter. It was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare, Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat at a moment. Better than before, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, and because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because round her sweet supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle with your arms, there was the odious scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat, and for an instant the face changed into that of a sheep. Then, the sheep face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier, who seemed to be advancing huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring and seeming to spring off the surface of the screen, so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats. But in the same moment, Drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother, black-haired, black-mustachioed, full of power and mysterious calm, and so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few moments of encouragement, the sort of words that were uttered in the din of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then, the face of Big Brother faded away, and instead the three slogans of the party stood out. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it had made on everyone's eyeballs was too vivid to wear off immediately. The little sandy-haired woman had flung herself forward over the back of the chair in front of her. With a tremulous murmur that sounded like "My Saviour," she extended her arms towards the screen. Then, she buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. Okay, and I think with this is a good point that we can put a pin in today as we move on to our next reading room session. Let's take a recap of what we have covered over here in our reading room session for today. Touching on the themes covered in Big Brother. In Big Brother's 1984, we talked about Winston reporting for work and going for his daily 2-minute hate sessions where he looked around and observed everyone reacting around him. Okay, how did they react to the imagined threat of Goldstein? Whether or not Goldstein is an actual person, whether or not he's an actual figure, yet he was weaponized and used as a figure of hatred to try to pull everyone's attention towards him, to get everyone to unite against this image of Goldstein and what he represented. Okay, so this is an important concept that has showed up multiple times throughout history called negative cohesion, uniting a group of people based on a shared hatred or a shared disgust towards an external threat or external force. We see it in Nazi Germany, where there was negative cohesion against the Jewish population. We see it in the communist regime of USSR, of the Soviet Union, where Stalinists managed to unite them over hatred towards Leon Trotsky, thus pushing him and the White Coats out of the Soviet Union. And we have seen multiple times throughout history as well, right? Bonding and uniting a group of people by getting them to look and direct their hatreds towards an external threat. Okay, so homework for today, before we move on to our next reading room session, look at different points in history, right? What are some other examples of negative cohesion that have occurred throughout history? Okay, by getting your group of people to unite together, not based on a shared characteristic or a shared feature, but rather a shared hatred towards an external force. Okay, has that occurred in any point in history? Has that even occurred in Singapore's history? Okay, something to think about over here for our next reading room session. Okay, do you have any questions about what we've covered for today's topic? Any questions about today's reading room session? Otherwise, I think that's a good time to put a pin in this, but stay tuned. We'll be taking a short break before moving directly on to our practice paper session for today. Okay, so stay tuned to our TikTok page to stay up to date with our latest notifications and to be updated when we are going live for our live streams. Okay, so until then, I'll be seeing all of you very soon, very shortly. This is Teacher Marcus signing off. I'll see you all for our teaching session later today. Bye. Bye-bye.